The night Annie Carver pressed her needle through the silk lining of Warren Covington's coat, her hands were trembling so badly she had to stop 3 times just to keep from drawing blood. It was the autumn of 1873, and the town of Dusty Creek, Texas, sat at the edge of the world the way most frontier towns did, raw and hopeful and half-finished, with unpainted storefronts that caught the wind and a main street that turned to mud every time the sky opened up. Annie had lived there for 4 years, first as a wife and then, for the last 14 months, as a widow. She knew every creak of the floor in her small house behind the dry goods store. She knew which step on the porch would give you away if you tried to come home late. She knew the sound the wind made when it moved through the sage at 2 in the morning, that low, plaintive moan that sounded too much like a person grieving. She had become very familiar with grief. Tom Carver had been a decent man. Not a remarkable man, but decent, steady and kind and hardworking, the sort of man who fixed things without being asked and never raised his voice in anger. He had come down with fever in August of 1872 and was gone before the end of September, leaving Annie with a small house, a modest savings tucked behind a loose board in the kitchen wall, and a daughter named Ellie who was 3 years old and already looked so much like her father that it made Annie's chest ache every time the child smiled. She had managed. That was the word people used when they talked about Annie Carver. She had managed. She ran the dry goods store that Tom had started, ordering stock from the supply house in San Antonio, keeping the accounts in a neat ledger, making sure Ellie ate and slept and had proper shoes. She did not complain. She did not ask for much. She stitched quilts at night when the store was closed and Ellie was sleeping, and she sold them to travelers passing through, and she put that money in the same wall behind the kitchen, and she did not think too much about the future. She had not expected Warren Covington. He came into Dusty Creek on a Wednesday morning in April of 1873, riding a dark brown mare and leading a pack mule loaded with surveying equipment. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm, not gray and not quite blue, but something unsettled in between. He was not particularly handsome in the conventional way, but he had a steadiness about him, a way of standing with his weight evenly distributed like a man who expected the ground to hold him, which Annie noticed first because it was so different from the way most men in Dusty Creek stood, always slightly pitched forward or back as if ready to run. He came into her store to buy rope and salt and a new tin canteen, and he paid without haggling, which she also noticed, and he said thank you when she handed him his change, and he looked at her when he said it, actually looked at her, not through her the way men sometimes looked at widows, as if the tragedy had rendered her somehow transparent. He was in town for 3 weeks that first time. He was working for the Texas Land Commissioner's office, surveying parcels along the river corridor for a new settlement proposal. He came into her store twice more before the end of the week, once for coffee beans and once, she suspected, for no particular reason at all. The second time he came in with no particular reason, he stayed for an hour and a half. He sat on the barrel near the door while Ellie, who was 4 by then and deeply suspicious of strangers, tested him by handing him a wooden horse and watching to see what he would do with it. He made the horse walk across his knee and then rear up and then fall dramatically off the edge, and Ellie laughed so hard she had to hold her own stomach, and Annie stood behind the counter with a bolt of calico in her arms and felt something move in her chest that she had been very deliberately not feeling for 14 months. Over the 3 weeks he was in town, Warren Covington became a fixture in a way that did not feel intrusive. He ate supper at the Dusty Creek Inn on most nights, but he stopped into Annie's store most afternoons. He told her about the land he was surveying, about the creeks and the cottonwoods and the flat stretches of black soil that would hold a crop like a promise. He told her about growing up in Virginia before the war had burned most of his family's land to ash and scattered the rest. He told her about coming west after the war because he could not stand the smell of the place anymore, the way even the good memories seemed to carry smoke in them. She told him things too. Small things at first, that she made the best biscuits in Dusty Creek, which was not a boast because it was simply true, and that Ellie was terrified of thunderstorms but fascinated by snakes, which made the Texas Hill Country a complicated place to raise her. Then larger things, that she had loved Tom in the quiet, reliable way you love a good fire on a cold night, not passionately but genuinely, and that missing him felt less like a wound these days, and more like a room in her house she had decided to leave furnished but did not enter very often. Warren listened the way some men could not. He did not rush to fill the silences. He did not offer remedies or judgments. He just listened, and when he spoke his voice was careful and honest, and Annie found herself listening to him with the same quality of attention she gave to things she wanted to remember. The night before he left, she invited him to supper. She made a pot roast with carrots and onions and cornbread on the side, and Warren played with Ellie on the floor after the dishes were washed while Annie sat in the chair by the window and did her mending. Ellie fell asleep on his lap, and he carried her to her cot without being asked, and tucked the quilt under her chin with such a careful, deliberate gentleness that Annie had to look away. He stood in her doorway to say good night and thank you, and there was a moment, one of those pauses that stretched half a beat too long, where the ordinary and the extraordinary seemed to be deciding between themselves which one would govern. And then he said good night, Annie, and she said good night, Warren, and that was all. She stood at her door and listened to his boots on the porch and on the packed dirt street, and she felt the most complicated feeling she had experienced since Tom had died, something warm and something frightened all braided together, the way a river looks when two different currents meet. She did not sleep. At midnight she was still awake, and she got up and lit the lamp and sat at her mending table, and she picked up Warren's coat, which he had left draped over the back of her kitchen chair because he had forgotten it in the rush of carrying Ellie to bed. It was a good coat, heavy wool with a smooth silk lining in burgundy, the kind of coat that had been expensive once and had been well cared for ever since. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. Then she threaded her finest needle with black silk thread. She was not entirely certain what she was doing or why she was doing it. She only knew that she had something she wanted to say to him and no decent way to say it, and she had always been better with her hands than with her words when it came to the things that mattered most. She folded back the lining at the inside hem where the silk met the wool, in the place at the very bottom of the coat where a man would only find it if he was looking for something specific, or if the lining finally began to separate, and he pushed his fingers in to check the damage. She stitched her name. Annie Carver. Small, neat letters, the same hand she used for the quilt labels she sold to travelers, the one she always signed so that whoever bought the quilt would know who had made it. She stitched Annie Carver in black silk against the burgundy lining in the fold at the bottom hem, and when she was finished she smoothed the silk back over it so that nothing showed at all. Then she sat in the dark with the coat in her hands and tried to figure out what she had just done. She had not declared love. She was not certain she loved him. She had known him for 3 weeks, for heaven's sake. What she had done was more like leaving a door open, a very small door in a very hidden place. Something that said, if you ever come back and look hard enough at the things you carry, you will find me here. I was here. This mattered. She hung the coat on the peg by the front door before she went to bed. In the morning she opened the store early, and Warren came at 8 o'clock, looking faintly embarrassed about the coat, and she handed it to him without commentary, and he thanked her, and she asked if he would be passing through Dusty Creek again on his way back to Austin, and he said he expected he would in a couple of months once the survey was finished. She said she expected the store would be open. He smiled at that, a real smile, not a polite one, the kind that used his whole face, and then he put on the coat and walked out her door, and she watched him ride out of Dusty Creek toward the southern horizon until the dust settled back down and the street looked ordinary again. He did not come back in a couple of months. He did not come back in 4 months or 6. She heard, through the loose and unreliable telegraph of frontier gossip, that the survey had been complicated by a boundary dispute that had stretched into a legal proceeding in Austin, and then that the legal proceeding had been further complicated by a land fraud case that had gotten one of the senior commissioners arrested, and then she stopped hearing anything at all. The months began to accumulate. Dusty Creek moved through its seasons the way small towns did, with the small dramas and small celebrations that made up the fabric of a life. Annie ran her store. She raised Ellie, who was growing at an alarming rate, and had developed a passion for reading that necessitated ordering books from San Antonio alongside the dry goods, which the other residents of Dusty Creek found faintly suspicious but tolerated because they needed the dry goods. Annie made her quilts. She attended church on Sundays and the occasional social at the schoolhouse, and she was perfectly pleasant to everyone, and she did not talk about Warren Covington, but she thought about him. She thought about him in the particular way you think about something that has not quite resolved itself, that sits at the back of your mind like an unanswered question, not painful exactly but persistent. She thought about the way he had listened. She thought about Ellie asleep on his lap. She thought about the coat and what she had done to the coat, and occasionally she thought about whether it had been foolish, which she supposed it had been, and whether she regretted it, which she was not quite sure about. The first winter came and went. Ellie turned 5 and developed a severe and passionate attachment to a stray dog she named Captain, who had one gray eye and one brown eye, and absolutely no manners whatsoever. The dry goods store had a good year, because 2 new families had settled in the valley east of town, and they needed everything. Annie hired a boy named Samuel to help with the heavy stock, which freed up enough of her time to expand the quilting operation slightly, and she sent 3 quilts to a merchant in San Antonio who sold them to a furniture house in Houston, and sent back a bank draft that was more money than she had seen in one place since Tom had died. The second spring came. Annie turned 27. She was not old by the standards of the world, but the frontier had a way of making people feel older, the way the sun and the wind worked on things, not rotten, just seasoned. She looked in her small mirror on the morning of her birthday and thought she looked like a woman who had been through some weather, which she supposed was accurate, and not necessarily a bad thing. She was standing behind her counter on a Thursday afternoon in May, going through the inventory ledger with Samuel and arguing pleasantly about whether they needed another case of canned peaches before the summer, when the bell above the door rang and she looked up. Warren Covington was standing in the doorway. He was thinner than she remembered. He had more lines around his eyes and a scar along his jaw that had not been there before, a thin white line about 2 inches long. His coat, the coat, was over his arm. He was holding it like something he had just taken off, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name, something between relief and something much more complicated than relief. She held onto the ledger for a moment longer than necessary. "You are back," she said. "I am back," he said. Samuel looked between them and made a decision that spoke well of his intelligence, announcing that he would go check the storeroom, and disappeared. Warren came the rest of the way into the store and set the coat down on the barrel near the door, the same barrel he had sat on 2 years ago while Ellie tested him with the wooden horse. He pulled his hat off and held it and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the store was very quiet except for the sound of the wind outside. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do not owe me anything," she said, because it was the right thing to say and also because she meant it. "You said you might come back through. You are back through. That is enough." He shook his head. "Annie," she waited. He set his hat down on the barrel beside the coat. He ran a hand through his hair, which was shorter than it had been, more disciplined somehow. He had the look of a man who had been somewhere difficult and had come back intact but changed. "The survey turned into a legal matter," he said. "I told you it might. What I did not tell you, because I did not know it then, was that the man I was working under, a commissioner named Holt, had been taking bribes from land speculators for 2 years. When the investigation started, Everyone connected to the survey was subpoenaed. I spent 11 months in Austin testifying, reviewing documents, watching a very unpleasant legal proceeding that ended with 3 men in prison and my professional reputation requiring what I will call significant rehabilitation. She listened without interrupting. After Austin, I took a survey job in New Mexico Territory. I needed the work, and I needed to be somewhere that was not a courtroom. I was in the territory for almost 9 months. There was no reliable mail service to or from most of the places I was working, and when there was, he stopped. I started letters to you. I did not finish them because I did not know what I was entitled to say. She looked at him for a long moment. What do you mean, entitled? I mean that I had been in your store 3 times over 3 weeks, he said. I ate 1 supper at your table. I fell asleep in your chair, he caught himself. Ellie fell asleep in my lap. I liked you enormously, but that does not constitute a claim. You are a widow with a daughter and a business and a full life, and it seemed to me that writing to you from New Mexico as if there was some understanding between us would have been presumptuous. Annie put the ledger down on the counter very carefully. That, she said, is the most thoroughly misguided piece of logic I have heard in some time. He blinked. Writing to someone to tell them that you are alive and thinking of them is not presumptuous, she said. It is courteous. What you have done instead by staying silent for 2 years is considerably more complicated than a letter would have been. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are right." "I usually am," she said, and then, because it seemed important, "I am glad you are alive, Warren. I am glad you are here." The air between them shifted in the way it had shifted in her doorway 2 years ago. That question of whether the ordinary or the extraordinary would settle. And this time it did not quite resolve itself either, because Ellie chose that moment to come barreling through the back door from the yard with Captain at her heels, skidding to a stop on the wooden floor and staring at the tall man near the barrel. Ellie was 6 now, with Tom's red-gold hair pulled into 2 braids and Annie's dark eyes, and absolutely no patience with social uncertainty. She looked at Warren with the direct, assessing stare of a child who had learned early that people came and went and that the best policy was to determine quickly which category a person belonged to. "I remember you," she said. "You made the horse fall off your knee." Warren looked at her with an expression of genuine delight. "I did. Your horse was very brave about it." Ellie considered this. "Captain ate the horse," she said, as if this was relevant information that needed to be on the record. She pointed at the dog, who was sitting on Warren's foot and looking up at him with the cheerful entitlement of an animal that had never been told no. "He eats everything. Mama said it is because he was a stray and he never knew when he would eat again, so now he eats all the time, even things that are not food." "That seems like a reasonable response to uncertainty," Warren said seriously. Ellie looked at him for another beat, and then apparently reached a conclusion, because she picked up her book from the shelf near the door. It was a battered copy of Grimm's fairy tales that had been ordered 3 times because she wore out each copy, and went to sit in the chair near the window and began to read. Warren watched her for a moment with an expression that Annie recognized from 2 years ago, that careful, deliberate tenderness. Then he looked back at Annie. "How long are you in Dusty Creek?" she asked. "I have a new commission," he said. 6 months at least, surveying the river corridor north of here. The settlement proposal that started all of the trouble with Holt has been revived under new management, and they need the survey done properly this time." He paused. "I asked specifically for this territory." She did not ask him why he had asked specifically for this territory. She thought they both knew why, and saying it out loud in the store in front of Ellie and the back door, where Samuel might reappear at any moment, seemed like it would require a more formal occasion. "You will need a place to stay," she said. "The inn is decent, but Mrs. Hobart charges extra for the livery. Jed Parson rents the room above his feed store if you want something that is your own space. I will tell you that the floor is level, which is more than you can say for the inn." "I will talk to Jed Parson," he said. He picked up his hat. He picked up his coat. He was about to put it on, and then he paused, and she watched him smooth his hand over the front of it, down the lapels and then to the hem, the absent gesture of a man who had worn this coat for 2 years and knew its weight like a second skin. He did not open the lining. Not today. He put the coat on and said he would come by tomorrow morning if that suited her, and she said that suited her fine, and he left. Annie stood behind her counter for a long moment after the bell stopped ringing, looking at the door. Then she put the ledger back under the counter and went to find Samuel and told him they did in fact need another case of canned peaches. Warren settled into the room above Jed Parsons' feed store and fell back into the rhythm of Dusty Creek with the ease of a man who had been paying attention to how things worked here even 2 years ago, when he should have only been passing through. He rode out most mornings before 7 with his surveying equipment into the river corridor and the rough country north of town, and he came back most evenings with the equipment packed away and the dust of the day on him, and he stopped into Annie's store most afternoons before she closed. It was different this time. The 3 weeks 2 years ago had been a kind of discovery, both of them feeling carefully along the edges of something they were not certain was there. This was recognition. The conversation picked up somewhere in the middle, as if the 2 years of silence had been an interruption rather than an absence, and they talked the way people talk when they have both been thinking about the same things separately for a long time and are glad to be able to say them out loud finally. He told her about New Mexico. He told her about the Sangre de Cristo Mountains at sunset, which he said was one of the most extravagant things he had ever seen. The way the light came off the rock in shades of rose and copper that seemed too theatrical to be natural. He told her about the Navajo men he had worked with in the north of the territory, 2 of them hired as guides because they knew the canyon country better than any map showed it, and he talked about them with a respect that was genuine and specific, not the casual condescension that most white men in 1873 applied to everyone who was not like them. He said their names correctly, which was more than most men bothered with. Annie told him about the store. She told him about the quilts going to Houston. She told him about the year she had learned to butcher her own hog because the man she had paid to do it moved to San Antonio, and no one in Dusty Creek wanted to take over the job, and the matter-of-fact way she described learning this skill made Warren laugh until he had to sit down. She told him about the loneliness, too. Not directly. She was not the kind of woman who announced her grief, but in the ways she described evenings, in the careful way she said things like after Ellie is in bed, or in the small pauses before she mentioned Tom's name, which she mentioned easily and without drama, but which always seemed to cost her something, however briefly. Warren heard all of it, and he did not try to solve it or explain it away, and that quality of listening, which she had remembered for 2 years, was exactly as she had remembered it. He joined her and Ellie for supper twice in the first 2 weeks, and then 3 times in the 3rd week, which Ellie noticed and regarded with the same evaluative interest she applied to everything. The child had taken to Warren in the particular way children take to someone who treats them as a person rather than a category. She talked to him at the supper table with the same directness she used with Annie, debating the relative merits of various fairy tale characters with absolute seriousness, and Warren engaged with these debates in kind, which impressed her considerably. The first Sunday in June, Warren asked Annie if she would like to ride out with him to see the river bend 3 miles north of town, which he said was particularly fine in the morning light. Ellie was spending the day with Mrs. Hobart, who ran the inn and was Ellie's particular favorite because she made ginger cookies without being asked. Annie closed the store at noon and saddled the old bay mare she kept at Jed Parsons' livery, and they rode north along the river corridor into the rough, beautiful country that Warren had been mapping for the past 6 weeks. She had forgotten how much she loved being on a horse in open country. In the years of running the store and raising Ellie and managing the ledgers and the quilting and all of it, She had not ridden for pleasure in a very long time, and the sensation of it, the horse moving under her and the wind coming off the river and the enormous Texas sky overhead, felt like something being returned to her. They rode mostly without talking, which was comfortable rather than awkward, and when they reached the river bend he had mentioned, she understood why he had wanted her to see it. The river curved here between two stands of cottonwood and willow, and the morning light came through the leaves at an angle that turned the water to silver and the leaves to a dozen different shades of green. And on the far bank, a great blue heron stood in the shallows with the absolute stillness of something that had decided it was not going anywhere. They sat on the bank for a long time. Warren talked about the survey. He had a way of describing the land that made it sound like a living thing, which she supposed it was, all those rivers and creek beds and fault lines that ran beneath the surface determining what would grow and what would wash away and where people could live and where they could not. He talked about it with a kind of love that she recognized, the way you talked about something that had not let you down. "Did you think about this place?" she asked. "When you were in New Mexico?" He looked at the heron across the river which had not moved. "I thought about Dusty Creek," he said. "The territory, or the town." He was quiet for a moment. "The store," he said. "The particular quality of the light in the store in the late afternoon. The way Ellie handed me that horse and waited to see what I would do with it." He paused. "You, Annie, I thought about you." She had not expected him to say it that plainly, and the plainness of it undid her a little the careful composure she had been maintaining since he walked back through her door. "I thought about you too," she said. He turned to look at her. She was watching the heron. "Then I should have written," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have. I am sorry." She looked at him then. He meant it completely, the way people meant things when they were not performing an apology but actually giving one. She felt the apology land somewhere real. "You are forgiven," she said. "You were being careful. I understand careful. I have been careful for a very long time." She looked back at the river. "Careful is safe, but it is also very lonely, and I think both of us have been lonely longer than we needed to be." The heron on the far bank spread its wings suddenly, enormous and gray, and launched itself upstream in a long, slow arc above the water, and they both watched it until it disappeared around the bend. They rode back to town in the afternoon light, and when they reached her house behind the store he helped her with the mare and they stood in the yard in the long gold hour before supper, and he kissed her once carefully, the way he did most things with his whole attention, and a quality of steadiness that made her feel like the ground was absolutely solid under her feet. She did not realize she had been worried about that until she felt it, how solid the ground felt. The summer of 1873 moved through Dusty Creek like something out of a story. Not loudly, there were no grand gestures or dramatic declarations, because neither Annie Carver nor Warren Covington was built for grand gestures. What there was instead was accumulation, the slow and steady gathering of small moments that together made something unmistakable. There were Sunday rides to the river, and there were suppers at Annie's table, and there were evenings on the porch after Ellie was in bed, talking about everything and nothing while the night came on and the crickets built their racket up in the sage. There were small arguments, one about whether Ellie needed a more formal education than the one-room schoolhouse in Dusty Creek could offer, one about whether Annie was working herself too hard in the store, one about nothing in particular that revealed clearly that both of them had strong opinions and were not accustomed to the negotiation of cohabiting opinions, which was actually a useful thing to know. The town noticed. Dusty Creek was a small place, and it paid close attention to itself, and the widow Carver walking out with the surveyor from the land commissioner's office was noticed with the particular quality of small-town interest that was not quite gossip, but was adjacent to it. Most people were pleased, or at least neutral. Doc Henley, who had delivered Ellie and been Tom Carver's friend, shook Warren's hand one morning outside the inn and said he seemed like a good man, which was both a welcome and a warning in one, and Warren understood it as both and appreciated it. Mrs. Hobart, who made the ginger cookies and ran the inn, and had appointed herself Annie's auxiliary maternal figure in the absence of Annie's actual mother, who had died 3 years before Tom, told Annie over tea one afternoon that she was glad to see some color back in her cheeks, which was the most direct endorsement Annie was going to get, and she knew it. Ellie, who was the real authority in any matter pertaining to her own household, continued her assessment through the summer with characteristic thoroughness. She tested Warren in 100 small ways, made him prove he could fix the broken hinge on the gate, made him prove he did not mind Captain sleeping across his feet, made him prove he could listen to her read aloud from the fairy tales without falling asleep, which eliminated several potential suitors who had come around in the previous 2 years, not that there had been many. Warren passed all of these tests with the patience of a man who understood that being approved by a child was not a lesser version of being trusted, but a more exacting one. In August, Annie's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Cooper Dell who had land 2 miles east of town, came into the store with a bruised jaw and a look of badly concealed panic to tell her that there were men, 3 of them, passing through from the direction of the Pecos country, who had been asking about properties along the river corridor. Asking in the particular way that suggested they were not planning to buy. This kind of thing happened in the Texas Hill Country in 1873. The land was valuable and the law was thin, and men who wanted something and had guns and no scruples could sometimes simply take it. Annie had heard enough stories from other counties to know that the stories did not always end well, and the ones that did end well usually involved the right people finding out soon enough. She told Warren that evening. He listened with his jaw tight and his hands very still, which she had come to understand was the sign that he was taking something seriously rather than dismissing it. He rode to the county seat the next morning and sent a wire to the land commissioner's office in Austin, and he came back with the sheriff, a capable man named Elias Hart who knew his territory, and the 3 of them, Warren and Sheriff Hart and Cooper Dell, made a plan. She did not see exactly how it unfolded because she was not there for the confrontation that happened 2 days later on the North Road. What she knew was that Sheriff Hart had deputized 2 men, and that when the 3 men from the Pecos country came through again, they were met with the kind of organized reception that made it clear Dusty Creek was not an easy mark, and they moved on. No shots were fired. Nobody was hurt. The whole thing resolved with considerably less drama than the stories she had heard about similar situations in other counties, and she thought that was because Warren had handled the Austin part of it properly, which meant the legal weight had arrived along with the armed weight, and the combination had been persuasive. What she felt, watching Warren ride back into town that afternoon with Sheriff Hart, was something she had not felt in a long time, the specific, complicated emotion of having someone in your corner who was both competent and careful about it. Tom had been a good man, but he had not been particularly strategic. Warren thought ahead. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. She said it anyway that evening on the porch. She said she was grateful that he had handled it the way he had, and he said that the land and the people on it deserved to be protected properly, and then he said something else quietly, something that had been building for months. "I would like to stay, Annie." She set her mending down. "When the survey is done," he said, "I would like to find a reason to stay in Dusty Creek, if there is a reason." She looked at him in the early evening dark, at this man she had stitched her name into 2 years ago without entirely understanding why, who had come back and turned out to be exactly what she had hoped for, which was the most frightening thing about the whole business. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should ask me properly, before I answer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up from the porch chair and turned to face her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, no restraint in it, no careful management of what he showed, just Warren Covington being completely honest. "Annie Carver," he said, "I rode away from this town 2 years ago, and I thought about you every single month of those 2 years, and I am not going to make the mistake of riding away again if you will have me. I would like to marry you. I would like to be a father to Ellie, if she will have me too, which I would be honoring if she told me to go jump in the river. I would like to make a life here, with you, in this dusty, half-finished town that has somehow become the place in the world I most want to be. I am asking you to marry me." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "She would not tell you to go jump in the river. She tested you all summer." "I know," he said. "I was aware of being tested." "And you did not tell her to stop?" "Absolutely not. She had every right to test me." Annie looked at the dark yard, at Captain asleep on the porch step, at the light in Ellie's window where the child was still awake past her bedtime reading, at the sky above the cottonwood at the corner of the yard. Then she looked at Warren. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and she stood to meet him, and he held her face in his hands with the same deliberate tenderness he gave to everything. And this kiss was not like the first one, careful and exploratory, but something more certain, something that knew its own weight. She thought about the coat. She thought about sitting at her mending table at midnight 2 years ago with her needle trembling in her hands, stitching her name into the lining like a message in a bottle thrown into a sea she could not see. She had not told him about it. She thought she would, but not tonight. Tonight she just let herself be held in the dark on the porch of the house she had managed alone for 14 months, and she felt the grief she had been carrying, not all of it, but a significant portion of it, shift and settle into something different, not gone but changed. The way a scar is not the wound anymore but still carries its shape. They told Ellie the next morning before the store opened. Warren sat across from her at the kitchen table while Annie stood at the stove, and Ellie looked at him with her most evaluative expression. "You want to live here," Ellie said. "I would like to, yes," Warren said. Ellie looked at him for a considerable moment. "Captain sleeps on the bed," she said. "Not the whole bed, just the end, but he does sleep on it." "I have absolutely no objection to that," Warren said. She looked at him a while longer. Then she said, "All right," in the tone of someone who has reached a formal executive decision and considers the matter settled. She went back to her breakfast. Annie, at the stove, pressed her lips together very hard. They married in October of 1873 in the Dusty Creek Church on a clear morning when the light came in at a low angle and turned everything warm. It was not a large wedding because neither of them wanted a large wedding. They wanted their people, the ones who meant something. Mrs. Hobart was there, and Doc Henley, and Cooper Dell and his wife, and Samuel from the store with his whole family, which numbered 6. Ellie stood beside Annie in a new dress the color of cornflowers and held Captain by his rope lead, because she had declared that Captain would attend, and nobody had the nerve to argue with her. The preacher was a thin, serious man named Whitfield who had been in Dusty Creek for 2 years, and had the look of a man who was perpetually surprised by how much he liked it here. He read the words plainly and without embellishment, and Warren said his part in a voice that carried, steady and clear, and Annie said her part looking directly at him the whole time, which made Mrs. Hobart reach for her handkerchief. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the inn. Mrs. Hobart had expanded the occasion well beyond what had been planned, which was her way of expressing affection. And there was music from a fiddle player named Miguel Ruiz, who played with the window open, so the sound went out into the street, and several people danced who had not intended to dance. Warren danced with Annie to a slow piece that Miguel played near the end of the evening, and they were not particularly practiced dancers, either of them, but they moved together with the same ease they moved in conversation, adjusted naturally, made room for each other, no one leading rigidly but both knowing which direction they were going. He held her in the October air of the inn, and she thought that she had not been held like this since long before Tom died, with this quality of intention, and she thought that she was not going to think about any of that tonight, and she pressed her forehead against Warren's shoulder and just felt the music move through them both. 3 months into their marriage, in January of 1874, Warren was going through his belongings in the room above the feed store that he had vacated when they wed, making sure he had cleared everything before Jed Parson rented it again. Most of it was already moved into Annie's house, their house now, but there were a few things left, equipment mostly, some ledgers from the survey. He went through the room methodically. He came home that afternoon with the coat draped over his arm. He had found it in the wardrobe where he had apparently hung it sometime in the summer, and then taken to wearing his heavier canvas coat as the weather changed. He came through the front door of the house, their house, and it still felt like a miracle, the reality of walking through a door into a room that contained Annie and Ellie and the dog and supper on the stove. And he set the coat on the table while he pulled off his boots. Annie was at the counter. She saw the coat and something in her went very quiet. He picked it up to hang it by the door, and as he moved it, the hem must have caught on something, the table corner. One of Ellie's books stacked at the edge, and there was a small sound. The sound of a lining beginning to separate slightly at the hem, the way old silk does when it has been handled enough over enough years. Warren stopped. He looked at the hem of the coat. He put his hand to it, the way you do when you notice a loose lining, running his thumb along the edge. Annie stood very still. He looked up at her. She did not say anything. She watched him feel the lining, feel the slight separation at the hem, feel the fold where 2 years ago she had pushed her finest needle through silk in the middle of the night. He pulled the lining back very carefully. He looked at what was there. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her again. Annie Carver, he said. It was not a question. He was reading the stitching aloud, the name she had put there. That was there when I gave it back to you, she said. The morning you left. He was still looking at the coat. I had known you 3 weeks, she said. I am aware that it was not entirely rational behavior. 2 years, he said. Yes, he looked up. His expression was doing several things at once, astonishment, and something that was trying to resolve itself into something much larger, and underneath everything else a kind of emotion that he was clearly not sure what to do with, this man who was so steady and so restrained with most things. I wore this coat every day I was in New Mexico, he said. Every single day. I know, she said. You were there the whole time, he said. Right there in the lining, I just did not know. She nodded. He set the coat down on the table and crossed the kitchen to where she was standing at the counter, and he took her hands and held them the way he had held them at the altar in October, with that complete attention. His hands were not steady. She noticed that they were not quite steady. Why, he said. That night, why did you do it? She thought about how to answer him honestly. She had thought about this answer for 2 years in the hypothetical, and now that the hypothetical was actual, she found that the honest answer was the same thing she had known at the time. Because you had listened to me, she said. Really listened. You listened the way someone listens when they are trying to understand something and not trying to do anything else while they do it. And you were kind to Ellie in a way that was genuine and not performed, and it mattered. And I had this coat in my hands, and I had this feeling in my chest that I did not have a vocabulary for yet, and I am better with my hands than with words when it comes to the things that matter most. She looked at him. I wanted to leave something in your keeping. I wanted you to carry something of me, even if you did not know it. Warren looked at her for a long moment. Then he brought her hands up and pressed them to his face, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her fingers and the slight unsteadiness in him that he almost never showed. I carried you, he said, every day, even before I knew it. Yes, she said. If I had found it sooner, you found it when you found it, she said. And I think it found you at the right time. She looked at the coat on the table, that good wool coat with its burgundy lining. I think the version of you who found it today needed to find it differently than the version of you who left would have. He thought about that. Then he said, that is wiser than it has any right to be. I have been thinking about it for 2 years, she said. He laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she laughed too. And it was one of those moments that you file away in the part of yourself that keeps the things you want to have always, the two of them in the kitchen in January light, laughing about the coat, Ellie's voice coming from the other room where she was reading to Captain, the smell of supper on the stove. He kept the coat. He kept it carefully, hung on the peg by the door where it had always hung, and occasionally in the years that followed she would catch him with his thumb along the hem, that absent gesture, and she knew he was feeling the stitching under the silk, and she felt the warmth of it move through her every time. The spring of 1874 brought changes to Dusty Creek that had been coming for some time. The settlement proposal that Warren had been surveying was formally approved by the Land Commissioner's office, and the result was 2 new families and a businessman from San Antonio who opened a small bank, which was a significant development for a town that had been doing its financial business through the dry goods store's back room for the past 3 years. The town began to take on a more permanent look, storefronts getting proper paint, a second well being dug on the south end of the main street, a new schoolhouse being discussed at a town meeting that went on for 3 hours and ended with general agreement that the schoolhouse was needed and more specific disagreement about exactly where to put it. Warren finished the survey in April and sent his final report to Austin. He had made a decision before the survey ended, one he had discussed with Annie over several evenings through the winter, and when the report was filed, he formally resigned his position with the Land Commissioner's office and notified his contacts in Austin that he was settling permanently in Dusty Creek. What he was going to do in Dusty Creek instead had been the subject of some practical discussion. He knew surveying and land management. He knew enough law from 2 years of watching the Holt proceedings to be useful, though not enough to practice formally. He knew horses. He had been handy with equipment and repairs all his life. What he ultimately did was purchase the vacant lot on the north end of Main Street and open a land and survey office, offering surveying services to the surrounding county and legal consultation on land transactions, which turned out to be exactly what Dusty Creek and the surrounding valley needed. Because the new settlement activity had brought with it a corresponding increase in boundary disputes and title questions, and all the complicated human business of people trying to claim and hold pieces of the earth. He was good at it. He was careful and fair and scrupulously honest, which the memory of the Holt proceedings had made an absolute principle for him, and word spread in the way word spread on the frontier, through the reliable telegraph of people telling other people which man you could trust with something that mattered. Annie's store had a good year too. The new families and the bank meant more traffic, and she had expanded the dry goods inventory to include a wider range of household goods, and the quilts continued to sell well to the Houston merchant, well enough that she brought in a second woman, a Mexican seamstress named Elena Vasquez, to help with the production, which was both a practical decision and a pleasant one because Elena was funny and direct and became quickly a genuine friend. It was Elena who noticed first, actually, in the way that women who are paying attention notice things about other women they are fond of. She said nothing for several weeks, which was also characteristic of her. Elena observed things thoroughly before she commented on them. Then one afternoon in July she looked at Annie across the quilt they were working on together and said, simply, "You are going to need to finish this one soon." Annie looked up. "Because in about 5 months," Elena said, without looking up from her stitching, "you are going to have other things to occupy you." Annie stared at her for a moment. Then she said, "I have not told Warren yet." "I know," Elena said, "you should." She told him that evening, after Ellie was in bed and they were on the porch where the important conversations happened, and he went very still in the way he went still when he was taking something seriously. And then something happened to his face that she had not seen before, not surprise, because she thought he had perhaps suspected as she had, but something beyond surprise, some profound, uncomplicated happiness that he did not have his usual restraint over. He pulled her into his arms without saying anything, held her long and close, and she felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of him and the slight trembling of a man who was very happy and not quite managing to be calm about it. And she thought again what she had thought on the porch when he had asked her to marry him, that the ground was absolutely solid under her feet. A boy or a girl? He said into her hair, which she knew was not a question he expected her to answer, but just the first thing that came out. "I have no idea," she said. "It does not matter," he said immediately. "Then Ellie will have opinions." "Ellie will have extensive opinions," Annie said. "And probably a list of requirements." Ellie did have opinions, and also something close to a list of requirements, which she communicated to both parents over the next several weeks with characteristic directness. The opinions included that the baby should have a name that was not stupid, that the baby should sleep in its own room rather than hers, that Captain should be explained to the baby early so there were no later misunderstandings about the dog's role in the household, and that the baby should be prepared for the reality that Ellie had been there first and therefore had certain established rights and privileges. Warren listened to all of this with complete seriousness and told Ellie that her points were well taken, and she regarded him with the satisfied expression of someone who has been heard properly. In December of 1874, Annie Carver Covington gave birth to a boy. They named him James Thomas Covington James for Warren's father, who had been the best man he knew before the war took him, and Thomas for Tom Carver, because it seemed right to Annie to carry something of Ellie's father into the new child's name, to honor the path that had led here. Warren was in the room when James was born, which was not the common practice, and which Doc Henley considered slightly irregular, but which Annie had insisted on, and Doc Henley had learned by this point not to argue with Annie Carver about things she had decided. Warren held her hand through the difficult parts and did not faint, which Doc Henley admitted afterward he had been privately betting on, and when James arrived, red-faced and furious at the world, Warren held him with those steady hands and looked down at him with an expression that Annie, even exhausted as she was, filed away in the permanent collection. Ellie was allowed in after everything was settled, and she stood on her toes to look at James in Warren's arms and said, with great authority, "He is smaller than I expected," which was so characteristic of her that Annie began to laugh even though laughing was uncomfortable, and Warren laughed too, and James, startled by the noise, opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. The winter passed with the particular quality of a household that has a new baby in it, exhausted and tender and occasionally bewildering. All the routines disrupted and remade around this new small presence who had opinions about everything, but could not yet express them in words. Warren took to the night feedings with more willingness than Annie expected. He would get up at 2 in the morning and bring James to her, and stay sitting on the edge of the bed while she fed the boy, and they talked in the low, specific way of people sharing a task in the dark, about things that seemed very important at 2 in the morning, and might have seemed less so in daylight but were meaningful regardless. He was a good father. Not a perfect one, and he would have told you so himself without needing much prompting, because he was the kind of man who was clear-eyed about his own limitations. He was sometimes too patient, which meant he occasionally let things go on longer than they should, and he was sometimes too quiet when what was needed was directness. But his love for both children was absolute and undisguised, and he showed it in the practical ways that children actually need. He was present, he was consistent, he was interested, and he was honest with them. Ellie, who had been working through her 7-year-old feelings about the reorganization of the household, came to her own terms with James by spring, when he was old enough to look at things and track them with his eyes. She discovered that if she made faces at him, he would sometimes smile, and this ability to make a person smile with her face was apparently sufficient compensation for the disruption, and after that she was fiercely proprietary about him. 1875 moved through Dusty Creek and through their life with an abundance of small good things. The land office was steady. The store was good. Alina became a permanent partner in the quilt business, with her name alongside Annie's in the label Carver and Vasquez, which sounded like a law firm but sold beautifully in Houston. Warren got his front porch extended by 6 feet, which he did himself over 2 weekends with Cooper Dell's help, so that there was room on the porch for 2 chairs and a bench, and still enough space for Ellie to walk her self-invented obstacle course past them without disturbing anyone. One evening in September of 1875, when James was 9 months old and sleeping in the house, and Ellie was inside reading and Annie and Warren were on the new wide porch in the blue-gray of early evening, Warren said something he had been carrying for a while. "Do you think about Tom much?" he said. She considered the question honestly because it was an honest question and deserved an honest answer. "Yes," she said. "Less with each year, but yes. He was a good man and he was Ellie's father and he deserved a longer life than he got. I carry that." "I am glad you carry it," Warren said. "I would not want you to have forgotten him." She looked at him. "You are not bothered by it." "He is part of who you are," Warren said simply. "He is part of Ellie. Forgetting him would change you, and I have no interest in a different version of you." She looked at him in the evening light for a long time. He was watching a nighthawk work the sky above the cottonwood, that swooping, erratic flight pattern. "You are a remarkable man," she said. He looked over at her with a slight, dry smile. "I am a man who has thought carefully about what I value," he said. "It is not the same thing." "Sometimes it is," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the armrest between the 2 chairs, and they sat that way in the cooling evening, while the nighthawk worked the sky, and the first stars appeared, and the house behind them was full of the sounds of their life, Ellie turning pages, James making the small sleep sounds of a well-fed infant, Captain padding around looking for an acceptable spot to lie down. In the spring of 1876, something happened that Annie had not been expecting, which was that her younger brother, Daniel Reed, arrived in Dusty Creek. Daniel was 23 years old and had been in Kansas for the past 4 years working cattle drives on the Kisham Trail, which had given him a lean, sun-browned look and a collection of trail stories that were entertaining in proportion to how much you trusted the teller. And Annie trusted Daniel completely, which meant the stories were extremely entertaining. He showed up in April on a bony Appaloosa he had won in a card game, looking for somewhere to land for a while. He had been at it since he was 18, the cattle drives, and he was not quite done with it, but he was tired in the specific way of young men who have been testing their own endurance for long enough to know its shape. He wanted to stay for the summer. He stayed longer than the summer. Annie was delighted to have him. She had been close to Daniel growing up, 8 years older than him and more of a guardian than a sibling after their mother died, and seeing him now grown, capable, fundamentally decent in the way she had always hoped he would turn out, felt like another one of those things being returned to her, those things that had been put down during the hard years. Warren and Daniel sized each other up in the careful way men did, and arrived at a mutual assessment of reliability within about 3 days, after which they got along without friction, which Annie had privately been a little worried about, because they were both men with strong opinions who expressed those opinions differently. Daniel loudly and with gestures, Warren quietly and with precision, but the combination turned out to work rather than clash, and they became genuine friends over the summer. Daniel was good with horses, which Dusty Creek needed, and he started helping at the livery and then started effectively running the livery. And eventually he had a conversation with Jed Parson, who had been looking for a reason to slow down for 2 years. And by the end of the summer, Daniel Reed was the new operator of Parson's livery, which he renamed Reed's Livery, and Jed Parson moved to San Antonio to live with his daughter, happy as he had been in years. What Annie had not anticipated was Alina. Alina Vasquez had been in Dusty Creek for 2 years and had established herself with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, making friends easily and enemies of no one, and being generally regarded as one of the more competent people in the town. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a Mexican ranching family from the south of the county who had been there before Texas was Texas, who had navigated the complicated and often unjust business of maintaining their land through statehood and annexation, and everything that came after with a combination of legal savvy and sheer stubborn endurance that Annie greatly admired. Alina herself had come to Dusty Creek on her own terms, which was the only way she did anything. She met Daniel in May, when he came to pick up a package at the store that Annie had left there for him, and Alina was at the counter. The meeting, as Alina described it to Annie later with characteristic dryness, went like this. Daniel walked in, said hello. Alina said hello back. Daniel stood there for 10 seconds longer than he needed to, and then he asked if she would show him where the best fishing in the river was, which was not how you asked someone to go somewhere but was apparently the best he could manage under the circumstances. Alina showed him the fishing spot. They went back the following week, and the week after that they were walking together on Sunday afternoons, which Daniel clearly regarded as the most important development in his recent life, and Alina regarded with a degree of composure that was not indifference, but was Alina's way of not announcing things before she was sure of them. Annie watched this from the comfortable position of someone who had very recently been on the other side of this experience, and thought it was wonderful and also slightly amusing, and she said nothing to Daniel about it, except that Alina was one of the best people she knew, which she meant absolutely. It was Warren who actually said the thing to Daniel that needed saying, one evening when they were sitting outside Reed's livery after hours going over some land paperwork. Annie was not there, but she heard about it later. "I want to ask her something important," Daniel had said, meaning Alina, and Warren had said, "Then ask her," and Daniel had said, "What if she says no?" And Warren had said, and this was the part that Annie had made him tell her 3 times because it was so exactly right. If you are with the right person, the asking changes something between you whether the answer is yes or no. If she says no, you have still been honest with her, and honest is better than silent even when it is harder. Trust me on that one, Daniel asked. Alina said yes. They were married the following spring, a May wedding that was considerably more elaborate than Annie and Warren's October ceremony because Alina's family came up from the south of the county, and they brought an entire celebration with them, music and food and dancing that lasted through the night and into the morning. Annie danced at her brother's wedding until her feet hurt, and she looked across the floor at one point and found Warren watching her from the doorway with that expression on his face, the unguarded one, the one she thought she might spend the rest of her life being grateful for. She went to him. He held out his hand and she took it. "Happy," he said. "Extraordinarily," she said. They danced. Dusty Creek in 1877 was not the Dusty Creek of 1873. It had grown enough to need a second general store, which Annie regarded without resentment because there was enough business for both, and the competition actually sharpened her operations usefully. The new schoolhouse had been built on the west end of the main street and had a teacher, a young man from Missouri named Hollis Price, who was 25 and serious about his work, and immediately made Ellie very happy because he had brought 2 boxes of books with him that she had not yet read. Ellie was 9 years old and had evolved into a person of considerable force and clarity. She was bright in the way that announced itself even in casual interactions. She asked questions that were better than the answers available to them, and she had an instinct for the moral architecture of things, for what was fair and what was not, that occasionally made adults uncomfortable in the useful way. She had decided she wanted to be a teacher herself one day, or possibly a lawyer like the ones she had read about in the newspapers Warren brought home from Austin when he went for business, and Annie encouraged both possibilities with equal conviction. James was 2.5, firmly established as the physical opposite of his sister. Where Ellie was precise and deliberate, James was a force of nature, constantly in motion, getting into things, requiring supervision of the vigilant variety, and completely charming about all of it. He had Warren's eyes and Annie's red-gold hair, which was an unexpected combination that resulted in a child who looked slightly otherworldly and was absolutely not, being entirely and cheerfully of this earth. "Captain," now 6 years old, had slowed slightly and had decided that his primary duty was to James, trailing the toddler around the yard with the patient, alert attention of a dog who has found his purpose. He still slept on the end of Ellie's bed. Some things were settled. The land office was doing well enough by 1877 that Warren had taken on a partner, a young man named Felix Bright, who had just finished reading law in Austin and wanted to practice in a place where the law was still being established rather than maintained. Felix was 26, earnest and thorough, and he and Warren worked well together. The combination of Warren's practical surveying knowledge and Felix's legal training proving useful in the increasingly complex property environment of the growing hill country. Annie had been thinking about the store. She had been running it for 6 years now, 4 of them alone and 2 with Warren's presence in Dusty Creek, providing the kind of daily partnership she had not realized how much she had needed. The store was profitable. It was well managed. It had been her lifeline and her identity for the hardest years of her life, and she loved it genuinely, but she had been thinking about what else she wanted. What she wanted, she told Warren one night in the fall of 1877, was to expand the quilt operation properly, not as a side business but as the main thing. She and Alina had built something real with the quilts. There was a merchant in Houston and one in San Antonio, and an inquiry from a furniture house in New Orleans that had been sitting on her desk for 3 months while she decided what she thought about it. The quilts were art, real art, the kind of thing that told a story and lasted, and she wanted to give that work the space and the time it deserved. She wanted to sell the store. She wanted to put the money into a proper workroom, hire 2 or 3 women from Dusty Creek and the surrounding area, and make quilts the work. Warren listened to all of this without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "I think you should do it." "It is a risk," she said. "You ran a store alone for 14 months after your husband died," he said. "You know how to manage risk." She looked at him. "You really think I should do it?" "I think you built that store when you needed it, and now you have built it well enough that it can be someone else's thing," he said. "I think the quilts are what you love and you should put your energy where your love is. I think you would be very good at it. I think the New Orleans merchant should hear from you." She wrote to the New Orleans merchant the next week. His response arrived within the month, and it was enthusiastic. He had sold both quilts she had sent as samples, and had inquiries for more, and would she be interested in an exclusive arrangement. She said she was interested but not in exclusive, because she had learned enough in 6 years of running a store to know that exclusive arrangements were comfortable traps, and she negotiated a preferred supplier arrangement instead, which gave her the volume without the trap. By the spring of 1878, the Carver Quilt Workshop, she kept the Carver name for the business, because it had its own small reputation now, was operating out of a proper workroom on the south end of Main Street, with 4 women working there including Alina, who had quietly become the most technically accomplished quilter Annie had ever seen. The store had been sold to a family from Austin who wanted to be in Dusty Creek, which felt right. There were harder things in 1878 too, because the world was not simple, and the frontier never let you forget it. 2 families in the valley to the east of town lost their crops to a late freeze in April that killed everything in the field, and the subsequent scramble to survive through the summer involved most of Dusty Creek in the way small communities absorb disaster when they function properly. The Covingtons, and Alina and Daniel, and the Hobart Inn and Cooper Dell, and half the town found various ways to shore up the 2 families through the hard months. Warren worked with Felix to ensure the family's land rights were secure during the period of financial strain, because land sharks were real and opportunistic, and the work was not glamorous, but it was essential. Annie organized a quilting bee that was ostensibly social, but was actually a production effort, and the 30 quilts that were produced in 2 weekends went to the Houston merchant at a price that covered the material costs, and left a surplus that was divided between the 2 distressed families. Alina managed the logistics of this with an efficiency that made Annie realize not for the first time, that Alina was considerably more formidable than she appeared. By the time the summer ended and the autumn harvest made things more manageable, the two families were still standing, still on their land, and the whole episode had reinforced something that Annie had believed since Dusty Creek had become her home, that a town was only as good as what it did for the people in it who were struggling, and that Dusty Creek was, by that measure, a pretty good town. In November of 1878, Annie discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Warren immediately, that evening, not waiting for Alina to notice it first. She told him in the kitchen matter-of-factly, and he put down the report he was reading and looked at her with the same uncomplicated happiness she had seen the first time, and then he said, "Does Ellie know yet?" And Annie said no, and Warren said, "She is going to have even more requirements this time," which was true, and they both laughed. Ellie's requirements for the new baby were, if anything, more comprehensive than the last time. She wanted to be the one to tell James, which she was allowed to do, and which she accomplished by sitting James down with a gravity he was not old enough to fully appreciate and informing him that things were going to change, and he needed to prepare himself. James, who was 3, said he wanted more eggs for breakfast, which Ellie considered an insufficient response to important news but which she noted in the record. The baby arrived in July of 1879, and she was a girl. They named her Rose after Warren's mother, who had been a woman of considerable strength based on the stories Warren told, which Annie thought was a good name to carry forward. Rose arrived in the world considerably more calmly than James had, which Doc Henley commented on approvingly, and she had from the very beginning a quality of watchfulness, looking at things with wide, serious eyes, that Annie thought was Warren's quality translated into infant form. Ellie received Rose with the solemnity of a person taking on a significant responsibility, and immediately assigned herself the role of primary educator, which was accepted by everyone including, eventually, Rose herself. James, who had been told to prepare himself and had done his best, was initially unsure about the new arrangement and had several weeks of difficult behavior that Warren navigated with the patience that was one of his particular gifts. And by September, James had decided that Rose was acceptable, partly because she would track his movements with her eyes in the way all young babies track moving things, and he had decided this meant she was watching him specifically because she found him impressive. By 1880, Dusty Creek was a town of genuine substance. It had a school and a church and 2 general stores and a bank and a land office and a livery and a hotel and the quilt workshop and a blacksmith and a small newspaper that had started publication in 1879, which was run by a woman named Dorothy Fitch who had opinions about everything and the ink to express them, which Annie found enormously satisfying. The newspaper had printed a piece about the quilt workshop in its second month of publication, which resulted in 2 new wholesale inquiries, and a personal letter from a woman in Houston who wanted to commission a specific quilt to give as a wedding gift, which began what would become a significant part of the workshop's business custom commissions, each one unique, each one carrying the maker's name in the label. Annie had kept the tradition of signing her work. Every quilt that came out of the workshop had a label with the maker's name on it. She had taught all the women who worked there to do the same, and she had told them when she taught them that a woman who makes something beautiful with her hands deserves to have her name on it. She had told them that anonymity was a habit the world had imposed on women's work for too long, and she was not interested in maintaining the habit. Alina had agreed with this entirely, and then added that it was also good for business, which was true and which made Annie laugh. The October of 1880 marked 7 years since Annie and Warren had married in the Dusty Creek church on that clear morning with the low light and Ellie in the cornflower dress and Captain on the rope lead. Ellie was 12 now, all long legs and strong opinions, reading everything she could get her hands on and already corresponding with a former teacher who had moved to Austin about what opportunities might exist there for a young woman who wanted a serious education. James was nearly 6, in school and thriving, with Holly's Price having identified him as a child who learned best through movement, which had led to some creative teaching approaches that the classroom had been rearranged to accommodate. Rose was 1, walking with the slightly drunk quality of a brand new walker, but doing it with determined focus. Warren was 38. His hair had gone to silver at the temples, which Annie thought suited him absolutely. He had the look of a man who had found his right place and was doing his right work, which is one of the more significant things that can happen to a person, and it showed in him, not in any softening exactly, because he was still the man who stood with his weight evenly distributed and expected the ground to hold him, but in a quality of ease that had settled into his bearing over the years, the ease of someone who is no longer managing an uncertain situation but living in a good one. Annie was 34. She was not the woman who had stood behind a counter for 14 months managing her grief with her ledgers and her quilts, though she was continuous with that woman. You could see the line of her, see where the widow's discipline had become the business owner's confidence, where the careful management of a dangerous quiet had become the assurance of someone who knew her own ground. She had more gray in her dark hair than she would have liked, but she had Ellie's opinion that it looked distinguished, which was generous if not entirely objective. On a Friday evening in October, after a week that had been busy and ordinary in all the good ways, James had lost his first tooth, a significant event. There had been a complicated property dispute in the Northern Valley that Warren and Felix had spent 3 days untangling. Alina had finished a spectacular commission quilt that all 4 women of the workshop had contributed to, and which was going to New Orleans packed in tissue paper like a painting. Warren told Annie after supper that he wanted to show her something. Ellie had James and Rose in the other room, managing the bedtime routines with the authority of a 12-year-old who had decided this was her domain. Warren brought the coat down from the hook where it hung. He had had the lining repaired, Annie knew, 3 years ago when it had finally begun to separate significantly. He had brought it to her and asked her to fix it, and she had relimited the whole lining with new silk, and in the doing of it she had restitched her name. Not in the same fold at the hem exactly, but in the same place in relation to it. The same black silk thread on burgundy. Annie Carver, because that was who she had been the night she had stitched it, and she kept the maiden name in the lining the way she kept it on the quilt labels. He held the coat out to her. He had opened the lining at the hem. Inside, next to her stitching, there was new stitching in a different hand. His hand, she could see from the uneven spacing that it was not a practiced needleworker, but it was careful, it had been done with care. She had not known he could sew, she had never seen him do it. She tilted the coat toward the lamplight and read what he had stitched in black thread against the burgundy silk. Warren Covington, 1880, his name, beside hers, in the same place. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the unguarded expression, the one with no restraint in it. "I thought it was time," he said. "You have been carrying something of mine since 1873, even if I did not know it then. It seemed right that I should carry something of you that I know about." He paused. "And that you should know I know." She held the coat in both hands and looked at the 2 names stitched into the lining, her careful even lettering and his larger effortful hand, and she felt something complete itself that had been completing slowly for 7 years, like a piece of cloth that has been worked from 2 sides and finally meets in the middle. "Warren Thomas Covington," she said. "Annie Louise Carver Covington," he said. She looked at him. "You know my middle name." "It is on our marriage certificate," he said. "I read it thoroughly." She laughed. He was smiling. The lamp made the room warm and gold, and behind the closed door of the other room she could hear Ellie telling James something very seriously, the way she told everything, and James responding with a question, and Rose making the sleepy sounds of a baby who was almost out for the night. She folded the coat carefully and set it on the table. She went to him. He put his arms around her in the middle of the kitchen in the October evening, and she stood in the circle of that steadiness that she had been in for 7 years, and before that had hoped for, without knowing quite what it was she was hoping for. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood at the corner of the yard, and the crickets had started their evening work, and Dusty Creek settled into its ordinary night around them. "I love you," she said, against his chest, plainly, because she was better with her hands than with words, but sometimes words were the right tool. "I love you," he said, into her hair, and meant it completely, the way he meant everything. They stayed like that for a while, the two of them in the kitchen with the coat on the table and their names stitched together in the lining, in the house that had been Annie's alone and was now theirs, in the town that had been a way station and was now home, in the life that had been managed carefully in the dark and was now, undeniably and abundantly, a life being lived in the light. The years that followed were full. They were not without difficulty. The frontier never ran out of difficulty, and grief came around again as it always does, Doc Henley dying in 1882 of a heart that had been giving him trouble for 2 years, Mrs. Hobart slowing down and finally selling the inn to a young couple from Missouri, who ran it well but whom Ellie held to an unreasonable standard for the first year, because Mrs. Hobart had been a fixture, and fixtures were hard to replace. Daniel and Alina had 2 children by 1883, a girl they named Lucia and a boy they named Carlos, and the cousins grew up together in the particular loud and cheerful way of children who live close enough to run between each other's houses, which Ellie managed with the organizational authority of an eldest who had decided that managing the family structure was her natural role. Warren and Felix expanded the land office in 1884, taking on a third partner when Felix's workload became genuinely too large for 2 men, a woman named Ruth Adair who had read law on her own time and passed the bar examination on her second attempt, and who came to Dusty Creek because Warren had heard about her through the Austin Legal Network and had written to her specifically. Ruth Adair, who was 30 years old and had been waiting for someone to offer her a real professional position rather than a clerical one, arrived in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1884 with 2 trunks and a thoroughbred horse and a reputation for not losing cases, and within 6 months she was the most sought-after legal mind in the county. Annie watched all of this, watched Dusty Creek grow and change, watched her children grow up, watched the workshop expand until it was employing 8 women and shipping quilts as far as Chicago, watched Warren's hair go fully silver and then begin to thin slightly at the crown, watched Ellie grow into the young woman she had always been becoming, formidably intelligent and deeply principled, who left for Austin in the autumn of 1887 at 17 to attend what was then the only normal school in Texas that accepted female students, and who came back in the summers and at Christmas and wrote letters every week, long letters full of ideas and questions, and the particular quality of intellectual excitement that happens when a person finds themselves finally in a room full of equals. She watched James at 14 become a person who was interested in horses and mathematics in roughly equal measure, who had inherited Warren's quality of steadiness and her own quality of practical determination, and who talked about horses in the same way Warren talked about land, with a love that was also a form of understanding. She watched Rose at 6 and 7 develop the watchful intelligence that had been present in her eyes from the beginning, the child who said very little but missed nothing, and she worked. She worked at the quilts with an ease that had replaced the grinding daily work of the store years, because the quilts were what she loved and love made work feel different. She stitched thousands of yards of fabric through the late 80s, working with Alina and the other women at the workshop bench, making things that were beautiful and durable and signed with their names. In 1890, 17 years after she had first pressed her needle through the silk lining of a coat at midnight in a small house behind a dry goods store in Dusty Creek, Texas, Annie Carver Covington delivered a new commission quilt to the merchant in San Antonio personally. She had not traveled much, the years of children and the business keeping her close to home, and Warren had proposed the trip as a kind of celebration. The workshop had just filled its largest single order to date, 50 quilts for a hotel in New Orleans, which Alina had organized and which had taken 9 months, and the San Antonio delivery seemed a good occasion. They went together, taking the train that had reached the hill country in 1885 and changed the texture of everything. Distances that had been a hard day's ride were now a few hours, which made the world feel simultaneously larger and smaller. Ellie was 22 and teaching at the Austin Normal School. James was 15 and fully capable of running the household in their absence. Rose was 10 and in Alina's keeping. San Antonio was larger than either of them had seen it before. It had grown considerably through the decade, the old Spanish structures and the newer American buildings creating an interesting conjunction of histories that Annie thought about in terms of fabric, the way old and new cloth could be worked together if you paid attention to the weight and the grain. They stayed in a hotel that was more elaborate than anything in Dusty Creek, and ate in a restaurant that served things she had never encountered, and walked by the river in the evenings when the heat of the day let up. On the last evening before they took the train back, they sat on the hotel's covered porch and watched the city settle into its evening, and Annie thought about the 17 years, about the distance between the woman who had stitched her name into a coat at midnight and the woman sitting here now. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. It was not a worried question. It was a taking stock question, the kind you ask when you are genuinely curious about the answer. Warren thought about it. He thought about things properly before he answered, which was one of the things she had loved about him from the beginning. "I regret not writing to you from New Mexico," he said. "I have always regretted that, not because of what might have happened sooner, but because you deserved the letter and I was too cautious to send it. I forgave you that a long time ago," she said. "I know," he said, "but I still regret it. I like to be accountable to the things I got wrong." He looked at her. "Nothing else at all." She took his hand on the arm of the porch chair. "Neither do I," she said. They sat there in the San Antonio evening and watched the lights come on along the river walk, and Annie thought about the coat hanging on the peg by the door back home in Dusty Creek, about the 2 names stitched into the lining in 2 different hands, her careful even letters and his larger, effortful ones, both of them in black silk on burgundy, together in the fold at the hem where only someone looking for something would find them. She thought about the heron on the far bank of the river, all those years ago, that great gray bird launching itself in a long, slow arc above the water and disappearing around the bend. She had thought of it often over the years, that bird, the way it was absolutely still and then absolutely in motion, the way it went around the corner without knowing what was on the other side, just following the current. You could not know what was on the other side. You could only know what you were carrying when you went. You could only know your name in the lining and hope it found the right hands. It had. Against all the odds of silence and distance, and 2 years of a man being too careful to write a letter, it had. She was very glad she had picked up the needle that night. She was very glad she had stitched her name. Back in Dusty Creek, the house behind the dry goods store that was now somebody else's dry goods store, waited for them with the children in it and the dog at the door and the coat on the peg. The workshop would open Monday morning with Alina in charge and 8 women at the benches making things that would last. The land office would have a full week ahead of it. Holly's Price was still teaching, 14 years in, and had recently told Warren that James Covington was the most mathematically gifted student he had seen in his time in Dusty Creek, which Warren had reported to Annie with barely contained pride that he was trying very hard to manage. There were years ahead. Good years, full years, the kind of years you could not see from here but could trust were coming, because the ground was solid and you had built carefully on it, and the people you had built with were people who stayed. In the morning, they would take the train home. Tonight they sat on the hotel porch in the San Antonio evening, Warren and Annie Covington, 17 years in, holding hands in the dark, and the city moved around them full of its own lives and its own stories, and theirs continued unfinished, still writing itself, everything important settled and everything still ahead.